everybody, welcome back to my channel. In today's video I'm going to be testing out some watercolor supplies by the brand Arteza, and I don't know about you, but I've been seeing this brand Arteza pop up everywhere lately, and it is building up quite a lot of popularity, especially recently. And so naturally I've had a lot of comments and requests asking me to review this brand and especially their watercolor supplies. So I was really happy when Arteza actually offered to send me their supplies and sponsor this video today so that I can test them out for you guys and give my review on them. So what I want to do first is show you the supplies that they sent me. They sent me some watercolor pencils, watercolors, and the paper to try out. So I'm going to go through all of the packaging and what exactly is included in these sets. And then I'm going to be testing out the different products, do lots of different tests. And finally, I'm going to create a painting using all of these supplies. So anyway guys, let's get into it. Firstly, I'm going to unbox the watercolor set, and this is a 36 pan watercolor set, and they are half pans, and it is from their premium range. And what I like about this is that it actually comes with a water brush pen, and they can be really handy when you're doing your paintings. So let's go ahead and open this up. So I've taken the set out of the cardboard box and the wrapping, and the packaging is actually really good for this. The fact that it's in a tin and got that extra layer, that box as well. So that's really good. Now let's open it up and see what we've got. So we've got the palette as well that we can mix the paint on. It's nice that they've come with a card like all of the colour swatches. I've not seen that done before. I don't know if some other sets do, but from all of the sets I've purchased, I've not seen them include a colour swatch card, so that's actually really handy. So you can see here that not all of the pans are actually fully pressed down, and we've got a couple here that are missing. Now I don't mind that too much because you can just put them back in and then you're fine. Okay, so like I said, it does come with this brush pen which you fill with water and can use it. Now I like the length of it, it's easy to hold, and we will test that out in a minute. Another thing that I can notice with this set is that some of these lighter watercolors do have a little bit of a dirty smudge to them. So to me this isn't a big deal because when I activate the paints I can just get rid of that when I first use them, but it is a little thing that I think could be improved even more. So that is it for this watercolor set. I'm really excited to test this out, especially this little brush pen. I think that would be really good. And now let's get on to looking at the watercolor pencils. So Arteza sent me the 72 set of watercolor pencils, and this is from their expert range. Now I really like this tin, it's very strong and very sturdy, and it's always great to have a nice tin to keep them all in. So in terms of packaging, I'm really happy with this tin. Now let's open it up. I like that they're all sharpened to a decent point. They're not really sharp, but I like that. I like that they are a bit more sort of longer and a bit blunter. It's easier to shade them down. They don't have to be super sharp with watercolor pencils. I like the range of colors. Now let's pick this up. So you can see all of the colors. I'm really happy because it looks like none of them are broken, none of them are blunt. They're all to the same level of sharpness, and that's going to be something that we will be testing out, is to see whether they sharpen easy, especially with the wood case, and see how that performs. I think there's a fantastic range of colours here. Everything looks great apart from these little handles that are a little tricky to hold. I think the packaging is really great and really strong and sturdy. So let's finally move on to the watercolour paper. With this watercolor pad, there is 32 sheets in it, which is a lot of paper. You can see how thick this block of paper is. And again, this is from their expert range. Like I said before, it is cold pressed, so it's going to have a little bit of texture. And what I love about cold pressed paper is that it works great with the wet in wet technique, which I use a lot. So I'm really happy about that. It is £140, which is the standard, so it's nice and thick. Really, with paper, you really need to test it out to see how it performs. So now that I've gone through these supplies, let's get into doing the tests. So anyway guys, let's get into it. Firstly, I started out by testing the watercolors, and I decided to create swatches of all of the colors onto the Arteza cold pressed watercolor paper to not only see how these watercolors perform, but how the paper handles them as well. And the first thing that I noticed straight away was how vibrant and pigmented these watercolors are. I was actually really surprised by just how pigmented they are. I realised soon after using them that I needed to add a lot more water to dilute them, because if you just use a little bit of water, then you get a really strong, intense colour, which is really great if you want your colours to be really saturated and bold. But if you do want a light wash, then you have to mix in a bit more water, which is really good because it means your paint goes further. Another thing that I noticed is that before, when we started, I said that the pans were a bit dirty, but once I added a little bit of water, you can see how clean even the lightest colours become. So that really wasn't a problem. So I continued to swatch all of the colours, and I was really happy with the selection of colours that was in this set. One thing that you may notice that I'm doing is, firstly, I'm adding a very light wash of the colour to the swatch, and then I'm going in and intensifying it by dropping in some more concentrated paint. And that is because I wanted my swatches to be a little more interesting looking than just a flat wash of colour. And I also wanted to see the range that was available with each colour. So you can see, because I've done this, because I'm using like the wet and wet method to add in lighter washes and then drop in some more intense colours, you can see that we can get an idea of the lightest possible colours from each of the pans, and also the darkest, most concentrated version of those colours as well. So here is an overview of all of the watercolours in the 36 set of the half pan watercolours, and I was really happy with how these performed on the paper as well. Now I wanted to test out my watercolour pencils, so I'm not going to swatch them all because there is 76, but I decided to take a range of the colours to get a general idea as to how they perform and how they blend out. So I start off by applying a very light layer of these watercolour pencils, so I'm doing all of the shading first, and then I'm going to blend it out with my water brush pen, and we're going to test that as well. So I used yellow, oranges, pinks, blues, basically all of the different colours to get an overall idea as to how these perform, and I even wanted to test out the black as well. Now I've filled up my Arteza brush pen, and I'm going to use this instead of my usual watercolour paintbrushes to blend out each of these swatches. And I was really happy to see that most of the pencil just melted away and gave a really beautiful watercolour effect. Now you will still see a little bit of that graininess showing through, especially if you do apply a bit more pressure, but that is usual with most watercolour pencils. So it does give a really beautiful watercolour effect, and it just means that you have more control as well when you're using watercolour pencils, because you can shade in all of the colours and have more control because it's a pencil, but then still get that beautiful watercolour effect that you want. And if you want to intensify the colours even more, but you don't want that grainy look, then you can directly go in with that brush pen and touch it to the tip of the watercolour pencil, as I did there. And as you can see, these also give very vibrant and pigmented colours, and there's only a little bit of graininess showing through. One thing that I did want to test is see what the difference was if I was to add a really light layer of shading, and then if I was to add more pressure to the pencil and be a little more forceful with the pressure and my pencil strokes. Now, as you can see, the light layer blended out just like all of the others did before, but with the more intense, more pressurized swatch, if that makes sense, the color is a lot more intense because there's more pencil down on the paper, but also you can see a few of the pencil strokes showing through. So to avoid any lines showing through too harshly, try to use light pressure. What I love about these pencils as well is that you can use them to create really fine details and lines, either before you add water or after to add more details and finish it off. And you can create some really beautiful gradients with these, just depending on how much pressure you apply to the pencil. Finally, I wanted to test out how well these sharpened. Would they break at all? Especially with wood casings, some of them can easily break. But what I was so happy to find with these is that I tested 3 pencils and all of them sharpened perfectly. You can see how sharp these points are, and you don't have to have as sharp and long of a point as this, but it just worked so well. So there's no problems with breakage when I test them out or when I use them throughout my painting as well. Now, a couple of other things that I did want to test out is I wanted to see how masking fluid worked on this paper, because a lot of watercolor paper, masking fluid can actually easily tear it. So I did test this out, and I did actually notice that when I let this dry, I added just some orange and pinks over the top once the masking fluid had dried. And when I went to peel it off, it did rip the paper. So if you do like using masking fluid, then this isn't a great paper for you. But I know a lot of beginners, and me myself, I don't use masking fluid too much, so this wouldn't be a big problem for most of my paintings. It's very rarely that I will mask something off. Another effect that I like to use sometimes is salt, and depending on the paper, some paper the salt effect doesn't work at all, and then some it does work. And again, this is a paper that didn't work well with the salt, and that wasn't the watercolor paint, because as you can see, I tried using the watercolors on a different paper and the salt effects did work. So again, this is just a little thing. It's not an effect a lot of beginners use, but if it is something that you use, then that's just something to keep in mind. But those were the only two little negatives that I found with the paper. As for the watercolor pencils and the watercolors, I didn't have any issues with them at all. I thought they were absolutely stunning, the colors, and they were just great. Now let's start an actual painting using these materials. I'm going to be painting a butterfly on some flowers, and I started off by doing a wet on wet watercolor background. Now I wanted to use the wet and wet method because I do use this a lot, and I wanted to see how well the paper takes that, because some paper it's hard to do the wet on wet method with because it just dries too quickly. But I was so happy to see that the watercolor effect, the wet and wet method, worked so well on this paper. As you can see, the colors are nicely bleeding out and giving me that really soft look. And that was a really big deal to me because I do use this effect and this technique so much. And if you guys do too, which I know a lot of people do, then this is a great thing about this paper. It does work really well with the wet and wet method, and the water didn't dry too fast, so you can go in and take your time building up your layers of watercolor. Once I've done the basic background with some greens and pinks and blues, I'm going to go in and start to work on the flowers. Now this is where I really wanted to test that brush pen and see how it worked, and I loved using this thing. It was so easy to control the paint, and it gave you really good control over the water as well, because you don't have to try and guess how much water is on your paintbrush. You could just, can squeeze a little bit more if you want a bit more water to come through the tube. It just made it so easy to get beautiful watercolor effects and also details, because the brush pen has got a really fine point as well. So I really recommend their brush pen. It was absolutely amazing, and I was so glad that it came in the watercolor set. So when you get the set, you not only get 36 beautiful, vibrant, rich colors, but you also get a brush pen, so you can go and create your painting straight away without having to buy lots of separate paint brushes. Now the only thing I wouldn't use the water brush pen for is obviously large areas. It's a tiny little brush, so it's not suitable for covering large areas, but it is so good for all of these little details like the flowers. Another thing that I found is that the paper worked really well with adding lots of water. So with the wet and wet method, sometimes watercolor paper doesn't deal well with adding a lot of water to it, but this paper worked really well with all of the layers that I was building up, not only on the flowers but on the background. So this paper was great and very sturdy, and it didn't warp too much at all, no more than my usual watercolor papers do. So I'm not going to be going too much into detail as to the process of how I'm painting this, because it's not really the point of the video. But if you guys do want to see the real-time tutorial for how I created this butterfly painting, as well as loads of other loose animal watercolor studies like the ones I'm showing you now, then they are all available on my Patreon in real time, along with loads of other tutorials. I've got over 300 tutorials on there now, all in real time, all with voiceover, as well as the sketch outlines I offer and the reference images and my materials list, so you can really follow along with me through the whole process from start to finish. Like I said, I do this with loose animal watercolor studies, realistic watercolors, and even charcoal studies like this with portraits and animals and objects, and even with colored pencils as well. So you get all that for just a small amount per month, either $5 a month or $9, depending on how many tutorials you want to get access to, and you get instant access to all of the tutorials when you sign up, and it's just a monthly subscription. So I'll leave a link at the top of the description if you're interested in seeing that. Now let's get on to the butterfly, and I wanted to use the watercolor pencils on this specific section to see how they worked, and I was just using a couple of the 76, so I haven't tried them all out. I was using a black, a few yellows and brown tones, and a green, blue and a pink. And the first thing that I did was I went in and I blocked in all of the darkest shades, and I went in between and added the lightest, then building up to the darker shadows. And I love how these apply to the paper. It was so easy, the color comes off very easily onto the paper, and you can easily layer up and add more pressure to get some dark values in as well. And then I went in and I blended these out using my water brush pen, and I just love how when you blend them out, the colors become even more saturated and vibrant. As you can see, the difference between the yellow that I'm blending out and the yellow that's unblended is such a big difference. It's so much more vibrant when you blend it out, and that's why I love these watercolor pencils as well. And then another thing that's great is that you can build them up and layer them up more and more. So with that first base wash, it's a little light, so I went in with more black and more yellow just to saturate and add more details. So what I really love about these pencils is that you get so many in the set. They are a great price and they are so versatile. You can use them to add details, and also you can use the brush on the tip of the pencil to make them act like normal watercolors as well. I'm finally finishing off with going in with a bit of gouache just to add in some highlights like I do with all of my watercolor paintings, and adding a few splatters to the background. Overall, I really love these Arteza supplies. They were amazing, and for the price, they are so great if you are a beginner and you want to get into using watercolors. They are really good quality supplies, very good, just like my normal supplies. I didn't see any difference between the watercolors that I use and these, and they are very affordable, so I would definitely recommend these if you are a beginner. I will leave a link in the top of the description as well if you want to head over to Arteza's website and purchase any of these supplies that I've been using. Once again, I'd like to say a big thank you to Arteza for sending me these supplies to test out and for sponsoring today's video. I'd love to know in the comment section what other watercolor supplies or any other mediums would you like to see me test out in the future. But I really hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you're new around here, and even tick that bell icon so you do get notified on my future videos. But that is it from me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye everybody.